Welcome to the YouTube channel Midnight Horrors. Today we will talk about the stories of the most infamous serial killers in the United States. The stories of Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy serve as painful reminders of the human capacity to hide one's true nature and commit horrifying acts. In the early 20th century, in the small village of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a terrifying tale began to unfold, painting the portrait of one of the most feared murderers in U.S. history. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, into a poor family obsessed with strict religious teachings. His mother, Augusta Gein, was an extremely devout woman who believed that women, except for herself, were the embodiment of sin and carnal desire. She tried to protect her son from the temptations of the outside world by isolating him from society, causing Ed to grow up in an environment filled with prohibition and control. From a young age, Ed displayed signs of abnormality. He was drawn to horror stories and materials about human anatomy. After the death of his father, and later his brother's mysterious death in a fire, Ed was left alone with his powerful mother. However, when Augusta died in 1945, Ed's life was turned upside down. The loss of his mother not only left a significant void in his heart, but also unleashed his darkest obsessions. The Gein farm became a grim and eerie place after Augusta's death. Ed began to lock the rooms his mother used, preserving them as a shrine in her memory. He lived in a small part of the house, which gradually became filthy and cluttered with garbage. But the scariest aspect wasn't the mess or dirt, but what Ed started doing in his isolation. Late at night, a thick fog enveloped the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Mary Hogan's tavern glowed in the dark, the yellow light streaming out of the windows, casting shimmering streaks on the damp ground. Inside, Mary was cleaning the last glassware before closing. Soft music emanated from an old jukebox, creating a warm and peaceful atmosphere. Mary was a strong, middle-aged woman with fiery red hair and bright eyes, always ready to face any challenge in life. She was the only one left in the tavern at this hour, as the last customer had long departed. Mary was used to late nights alone. She took pride in her work and always kept the tavern clean and tidy. As Mary prepared to turn off the lights and lock the doorbell rang, breaking the late-night silence. She looked up to see a man standing at the door. It was Ed Gein, a man she only knew superficially. He often came to the tavern but never drank much, merely sitting in a corner and staring into the empty space. "Hello, Ed," Mary said, trying to keep a friendly tone. "It's late, what do you need?" Ed stepped in, closing the door behind him and moving toward the bar. The light cast over his face revealed hauntingly deep-set eyes and tightly pressed lips. "I want a drink," he said, his voice low and cold. Mary nodded, poured him a drink and set it on the counter. "Here, have a drink, but after that I need to close up, it's late." Ed said nothing, merely staring at the drink before him. Mary sensed something was wrong, but she tried to ignore the feeling. She turned back to her task, continuing to clean the remaining glasses. Suddenly, Mary felt a chill run down her spine. She turned around and saw Ed looking at her with a disturbing intensity. Before she could say anything, Ed pulled a revolver from his coat pocket and aimed it at her. Mary had no time to react, standing there with wide eyes filled with horror. "Ed, what are you doing?" Mary asked, her voice trembling with fear. "Silence," Ed replied, his voice cold as ice. "I need to do this." Mary tried to back away, but it was too late. The sound of the gunshot shattered the night's peace. The bullet tore through the air, embedding itself in Mary's head, causing her to collapse to the floor. Blood pooled around her, staining the old wooden floorboards. Ed approached Mary's lifeless body, his eyes devoid of any emotion. He bent down, lifted her body, and placed it into a large burlap sack he had brought. He dragged the sack outside, loaded it onto his old pickup truck, and drove back to his farm, where darkness and madness awaited. Back at the farm, Ed dragged the sack into the house, where the dim oil lamp cast a faint light on the bizarre objects scattered around. He laid Mary's body on the table, his cold, unflinching eyes never wavering. Ed began his work, a task he had long prepared for in his sick mind. With meticulous and careful movements, Ed started skinning Mary. He had practiced on corpses he had dug up from the graveyard before, but this time, everything was more vivid and real. Mary's skin was removed precisely, piece by piece, without a single unnecessary cut. Ed's hands worked like a machine, steady and unhesitant. He had honed his skills over the years, and now he was creating what he considered a masterpiece. When Mary's skin was completely removed, Ed carefully hung it up to dry. He returned to the rest of the body, continuing his meticulous dissection and preparation. Each part of Mary's body was handled with care, each detail preserved. He was not just killing, he was creating something only he understood and cherished. The flickering oil lamp reflected in Ed's soulless eyes, creating a haunting and eerie atmosphere. Strange noises came from the next room, but Ed paid no attention. He was entirely engrossed in his work, like an artist lost in his painting. When he finished, Ed looked at his creation with a twisted smile. He had made something he considered beautiful, a work of art born from his perversion and sickness. However, to the ordinary person, it was nothing but a horrifying and gruesome sight. Ed gently cleaned his tools, preparing for the next time. He knew this was only the beginning, and many more creations awaited him. In the small house, the oil lamp remained lit, casting light on the strange objects in the parts of Mary's body, creating an everlasting, haunting scene. The police investigation found a receipt belonging to Ed Gein at the crime scene. They decided to go to his farm for further investigation. When they entered the house, they couldn't believe their eyes at the horrifying scene that lay before them. In the dark and foul-smelling room, the body of Bernice Warden was hanging upside down from the ceiling, gutted like an animal. But this was only the beginning of the horrors the police would uncover. Throughout the house, they found objects made from human remains that Ed had meticulously crafted over the years. On the table, they saw bowls made from human skulls. Human skin masks hung on the walls like grotesque works of art. A chair upholstered with human skin and other body parts were carefully preserved, scattered around. Notably, Ed had even created a suit from women's skin, complete with breasts and genitalia, to replicate the female form that obsessed him. These discoveries not only shocked the Plainfield community, but also sent waves of horror throughout the entire nation. Ed Gein was quickly arrested and brought to trial. At his trial, he was declared unfit to stand trial due to severe mental illness and was sent to a mental hospital for treatment. Gein spent his remaining years in a mental hospital, where he died in 1984. Although he was dead, his crimes continued to haunt the minds of many and became the inspiration for numerous famous horror works, from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Silence of the Lambs. Ed Gein was not just a murderer, but a symbol of the darkness and perversion in the human mind. His story is a grim reminder of the hidden corners in every person's soul and the terrifying consequences when obsessions and mental illnesses go unchecked and untreated. Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the early 20th century, was a peaceful place, so much so that it is hard to believe it would become the scene of one of the most horrifying crimes in U.S. history. Ed Gein, a name that would later become synonymous with horror, grew up in a gloomy house dominated by his fanatically religious mother, Augusta Gein. Augusta was a stern woman, determined to protect her son from the temptations of the outside world. She believed that all women, except herself, were embodiments of sin and lust. She kept Ed under constant control, isolating him from almost all social contact outside the family. Her death in 1945 left a deep void in Ed's soul, opening the door to the depraved acts he would later commit. Ted Bundy, another serial killer, grew up in a completely different environment. Bundy was charming, intelligent, and promising. He was not isolated like Gein. Instead, he used his outward attractiveness to approach and manipulate his victims. Unlike Gein, Bundy was driven by violent and sexual urges. He enjoyed the power of controlling and destroying the lives of young, beautiful women whom he deceived with his deadly charm. While Bundy moved from state to state, spreading terror and leaving a trail of victims, Ed Gein was obsessed with a single goal. He not only killed, but also sought to transform their corpses into grotesque works of art. When the police discovered masks made from human skin, bowls from skulls, and even a suit made from female skin, they knew they had found a madman with unimaginable practices. In a small apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was also committing his own horrific acts. Like Gein, Dahmer had a particular interest in human bodies, but his motives were different. Dahmer was obsessed with completely controlling his victims. He lured young men home, killed them, and then committed unspeakable acts on their bodies. Dahmer dismembered the corpses, kept body parts, and even consumed the flesh of his victims. Dahmer's actions bore a disturbing resemblance to Gein's, but his motives were more complex, involving twisted sexual desires and a need for absolute control. In Chicago, John Wayne Gacy, another notorious killer, was spreading terror as well. Known as the Killer Clown, Gacy often appeared at children's parties in his clown costume, completely hiding his true nature. Gacy lured young men to his home where he tortured, killed, and buried them in his house's crawl space. Like Bundy, Gacy had more victims than Gein. However, his motives were clearly sexual and power-driven, unlike Gein's, who was obsessed with recreating the image of his mother and other women. While each of these serial killers had different methods and motives, they shared one terrifying commonality. They exploited others' trust to commit their heinous acts. Gein, Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy each embodied the darkest parts of the human soul, driven by obsessions and pathologies that led them down a path of destruction. While Bundy and Gacy presented a facade of normalcy, masking their depraved actions with charm and friendliness, Ed Gein lived in absolute isolation, where his darkest nightmares were free to flourish. After his mother's death, Gein fell into a pit of despair and obsession. His home became a museum of horror, a place where his darkest dreams became reality. When the police stepped onto Gein's farm on that fateful day in 1957, they not only discovered Bernice Worden's body, but also faced an unbelievable scene. Objects made from human remains were scattered everywhere, from bowls made from skulls to a chair upholstered with human skin. But the most horrifying discovery was the suit, made from women's skin, complete with genitalia, which Gein had created to replicate the female form. To Gein, these were not just items, but the realization of his obsessions with his mother and women in general. In contrast, Ted Bundy was a cold and calculating killer. He used his charm and intelligence to deceive and abduct his victims. Bundy often approached young women by pretending to be injured or in need of help, then brutally attacked them. He enjoyed the power of controlling and destroying the lives of these women, a behavior entirely different from Gein's depraved obsessions. Throughout his years of killing, Bundy murdered at least 30 women, leaving a trail of blood and tears across the states he traveled. Jeffrey Dahmer, with equally depraved actions, had a similar story of isolation and obsession. Dahmer did not just kill, he performed horrific acts on the corpses, from preserving body parts to consuming the flesh. Dahmer was obsessed with completely controlling his victims, an obsession he shared with Gein, but his methods were more personal and twisted. Dahmer did not just want to recreate the image of an ideal woman like Gein. He wanted to own and control the very existence and bodies of his victims. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy, with the facade of a friendly and socially active man, was also a serial killer. Gacy used his charm and social standing to lure young men to his home. After killing them, he buried their bodies under his house, creating a house of death. Gacy, like Bundy, was driven by sexual desires and power, but his methods were more systematic and organized. Remember to like and subscribe to support us. See you tomorrow.